Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ahmed Al-Badri. I'm a Nintex MVP for K2 in the Middle East and Africa for the year 2021. This will be a demo session related to K2, complementing the series of articles that I've posted on the Nintex community. On my screen, you can see this is a screen sharing coming from the Nintex community. My user ID is Ahmed Al-Badri 86. I've written a series of articles which would help newbies to be introduced to K2 and how to kick off your automation journey. The series of articles basically aims to help newbies or people introduced to the tool in order to overcome the challenges and to give you a starting point of when to start or how to start your automation journey. The series of articles cover the concept of flow code, citizen development, business process management, and slowly start digging into K2 as a tool, the benefits of using K2, and how K2 can help you excel and rapidly automate all the processes in your organization. This complements the series called Low Code Automation and Nintex K2 5 Journey by Nintex MVP. Right, so digging into the K2 now. First of all, we'd log into the K2 designer. So I'm using a virtual machine and basically a test user. On the left-hand side, you would see the categories or your folder paths. I've created a folder for myself called Ahmed Al-Badri under the Nintex MVP folder. I've created, which should be the starting point of any buddy introduced to K2, is you need to have your common objects and your common views created before you can start automating. This would rapidly decrease the time span you would need to automate a process. So this video will be covering the common objects, which includes the common smart objects, your common views, and basically your management views, which you would need to create a process. As you can see on the left side here, the first starting point would start off with your common objects. So your common objects would be reusable objects, which you would probably use in any process. If you've been looking at my articles, you would know that I follow the standard form rule, which is the 3 standard forms: the initiation, action, and read-only forms. These forms constitute of common views, and finally your custom views, which would be custom to your process. However, these common views help you save time in the automation of your process. The first thing, we would go through the smart objects. Then we'll start talking about the smart views and then the management views. In the next video, we'll be talking more about a specific process, and we'll kick off automating a specific process. And that process we would be aiming to automate it in less than an hour's time. So to start off, we'll look at the smart objects. So smart objects, as mentioned in the articles, these are intermediary objects which communicate between the interface layer, which is basically the user layer where the user can enter in his input, and the database layer, which hosts the data which needs to be read or written to the database. The first object that we'll be looking at is something called the process.sob. Process.sob is where we would store the information about our process, the name of the process, the description of the process, and so on. So I've created these objects, but just to give you a feel of how this looks like. So if we press on edit, we'll be able to see the columns or the elements of the smart object which communicate with specific headers in the database. The first one would be the ID, obviously, which is an auto-incremental number. This is the data type. Then you would have the name of the process, which is basically expects a text data type, which is the name of your process. The description, which is of memo data type, which is basically an nvarchar max for those of you that use SQL. It allows you to enter an unlimited set of characters. Process prefix, which is like a abbreviation to your process, if you like. And the initiation form URL is where you would store the URL name of your initiation form, and the read-only form is where you would store the URL of your read-only form. Why we have these two, we'll come to know very soon during the rest of this demo. The next smart object would be the process instance smart object. The process instance smart object is more related to the instance of that specific process. So if my process name is called renewal of ID card, as an example, every time we would run an instance of that process, so everybody submits the request for a new ID card, then that would be creating a new instance of that process. In this smart object, we would be storing the process instance ID, which is your instance ID or that specific workflow number. The process folio is a mixture of the process instance ID and the date and time in which the instance was submitted, in addition to the abbreviation of the process, just to give it a unique value in the database. Process ID, which is the ID of the process, in order to link the primary keys of both objects. The name, which is the name of the process. The request date basically summarizes when the instance was started. The status, what is the final status or the up-to-date status of that instance, and the comment, what is the comment that was submitted with this instance. The third object, which we'll be talking about, is the attachment smart object. This is nothing more than a place to store your attachments and link it to a specific instance. So in K2, you'd be able to store attachments, whether it's Excel files, PDFs, and what other formats. And the process instance ID is basically the ID that connects the attachment to a specific request or a specific instance. We'd also move on to the action smart object. This is a very smart object, a very important smart object. Obviously, you have the ID of which is the auto number within the database. You have the action. So basically, this specifies what type of action a user or a actioner has taken on a specific request. So, for example, if you submit an ID, a request for renewing your ID, your manager might need to approve the request. So this stores the action of the actioner. It also captures the comment of the actioner. It captures his name, his user ID, the date and time he's actioned the request. And obviously, it is linked with the instance in order to be able to track the instances of your specific process. The final smart object, which is the system settings smart object. The system settings smart object is nothing but a place in order to make a dynamic URL for the different instances within your organization. So, for example, if you have a development environment, if you have a test environment and a production environment, so i.e. three environments, the beginning of your URL would probably differ between these environments, and that's why we have this object, in order to make the system settings smart object capture the URL dynamically without you having to change it manually in production and testing and the other environments. So we'll see how this works basically in our demo. This is nothing but to capture the URL of the environment in order to make it dynamic rather than you having to alter it manually in the different environments. I think this summarizes the common smart objects. Now, moving on to the common smart views. Now, these are very important because this is what the end user would visualize on the screen. We have a couple of smart views. These can be reused whenever needed. We will start off with the header view. The header view is basically a header. It might be a header for your organization. I haven't made it very complex, just for the sake of this video demo. But basically, all it has is a data label, which would capture the name of your process from the process table, and a status data label, which would capture the status from your smart objects. Now, if I go to the rules here, I've created one rule in this table, is when the view executed initialized, i.e. when this view is initialized or opened, what happens is it checks if there is a parameter process instance ID has been specified. Now, usually in the standard way I develop, the process instance ID is usually only specified after submission of the request. So if a request has been submitted, then it would go to the process instance table or smart object, which we've just seen. It would filter it with an input parameter process instance ID in order to get this last status of the request so that it can add it to the data label within the header. It would also go to the process.sob, filter it with the process ID, and it would get back the name of the process to share it in the header. And this way, the user can always know what form he's looking at and what the current status of his request is. Now, if the process instance ID has not been specified, i.e. this is a new request being opened for the first time, then basically it will use the parameter from the header called process ID, and it will filter it and get back the name of the process depending on the ID of the process provided. And we will see how this works in our demo. Right, so I think this covers the header view very briefly. The next view that we'll be looking at is the initiation view. The initiation view is nothing but a view that has basically a comment box and your submit button. This will be used in, I would say, 95% of standard processes. Again, in this view, we have two rules. One which is called when the submit button is clicked, and another rule called the process initiation rule. Now, when the submit button is clicked, it's quite intuitive. It means when this button is clicked, what would happen? What is the event that would happen? So if I press on this rule and I edit rule, I would see here that when the button is clicked, it's telling the system that it needs to execute a smart object, which is the action smart object, and it needs to use a create method in order to write to the database a bunch of things. Now, to the database, it would be writing the status initiated. So whenever somebody submits a request, it would be initiated under the action column. For the comment, it would capture the comment from the controls. It would capture the display name and the user ID from the system values, which is coming from your Active Directory. So depending who's logged on, it would take his display name and it would take his user ID. Name in Active Directory basically refers to the user ID. Display name refers to his display name. And the action date and time is also captured from Active Directory under current date and time. And the process instance ID obviously would be captured from the parameter of this view. So I would go to the parameters in the initiation form and I would drag the process instance ID here. Now, this would capture the initial details of that submit action. Now, the second thing is it will show a message. So it will tell the user your action has been submitted successfully, your request number is, and whatever the process folio is. The process folio, again, is a parameter here, and we will see how this has been, how the folio is created after generating the instance ID. The second rule, which is the process initiation rule, this is the rule that actually creates the instance. So it executes the process instance smart object, which we've seen. It uses the create method to create a row ID. As you can see, there's no input parameters, so the output would be the ID that was created. We would pass back from the database the ID that was created back to the parameter of this initiation view. It would then use the process instance ID, which is returned, and it would use the save method. We execute a smart object save method to save the process ID of this process, the display name again from Active Directory, the current date from Active Directory, the status, and the comment from the smart object, from the controls. We would then use the process.sob and we would execute a smart object method, process.sob, and we use get list method, which is a read method or a list method. We would use the process ID, which we've returned into the parameters, and we would filter out the process prefix from the process.sob. So we would get back using the ID number of the process. So let's say the ID of the number of the process is number 1. it will go look in the process.osb smart object looking for row ID number 1, and it would bring back what the prefix value of that row is. And then we would transfer data to the process folio. So this is how the process folio is generated. We would take the prefix that we've returned. We would use an expression, which is the date and time. We've created an expression. We'll come how we've done that. We'll see it in the next step. And we would use the process instance ID. So all of these will basically make up your process folio to make this instance unique and easily traceable. And then we would basically execute a smart object for the process instance to save what we've created as a folio. Now, coming back to the expression. So the expression is none other than basically a method of altering a specific value. So we use the replace method, which we get from the operators under text. The replace method basically removes something from the value that we do not want. So we would get the current date as an example here. We would remove the dashes in the current date format, and we would replace it with an empty string. So if your current date equals 21-10-21, then it will become 211021 without the dashes. And this basically will be added to the folio in order to make the folio unique. This summarizes the initiation view. The next view that we'll take a look at is probably the process instance view. The process instance view is nothing other than a view that summarizes or creates a summary of your process. So it captures your process folio, your request state, the name of your process, and the status of your process. How we do that is basically, again, we use the rule when the view executed initialize means when the view is initializing. If the process instance ID has been specified, i.e. if there's a request submitted, then we would execute a process instance smart object method. We'd use the list method to filter out the smart object with the process instance ID coming from the parameters of the view, and we will get back the process ID, the process folio, the request date, and the status. And then we would execute a process.osb smart object method, a get list method, which we would filter using the process ID we've just returned and get back the name of the process. And this way, this view could be used as a summary to whoever is approving the process to understand what this process is about, when it was submitted, this request was submitted, the name of the process, the status of the process, and the folio. The next view that we'll take a look at is the attachment view. So the attachment view basically is nothing other than a list view, which shows us basically the attachments that were submitted. Again, if we go to the rules, when the view executed initialize, if the process instance ID has been specified, then we execute a get list method from the attachment smart object. We'll filter it using the parameter of the view, the process instance ID, and we would basically, we don't need any output. These automatically come out of the box, but for any list methods, list views, we really don't need an output. The output will come back with all the values that we need. The only difference between the attachment view and the second view that we have here called attachment read only is the attachment view here gives you the option of attaching documents. The attachment read only view is just gives you a summary of the attachments where you can open the attachments without the capability of deleting or adding attachments. And this is basically to disable users from being able to delete attachments users prior to their approval have attached. So again, when the view executed initialize, basically we filtered the process instance ID and we get back whatever was, we use the process instance ID to filter out whatever was attached. All of these will make more sense once we go into the actual demo of creating the first process. The attachment, the action view. This is the view where a user can take an action. This is usually used in the action form, not the initiation form, and this is for the actioners. So in this view, basically a drop-down which stores the actions of it stores the actions of the approvers or the reviewers. It stores their comments, and the submit button is which triggers the workflow and the writing to the database. So again, in this view here, basically we have two rules. When the submit button is clicked, which means when this button is clicked, what would happen? And we have another cool log rule called log action history, which basically moves the workflow. So when the submit button is clicked, if we look at this rule, all it does is it executes the second rule called log action history, which is this one here. And the log action history here is all it does is it creates an action, which is the smart object. It executes a smart object method called action, and it basically uses the create method to write to the database. It would basically take from the action chosen by the user, and it will store it into the database under the action. It would store the comment, it would store the display name, current date, time, process instance ID, and so on and so forth. The action history, this is very important. This is a view which basically, it's a list view which stores all the history of actions within one instance. So if I have a process which has 2 or 3 approvers, then I, as a third approver, would probably want to know what the actioner before me has put as a comment or what action he has taken. And this would help me in my decision making. And plus, it carries an audit log to make sure that the right approvers have approved the process. Again, in the action view here, when the view is initialized, we would filter out the database using the process instance ID, and we will go to the action smart object using the getList method. We pass the parameter process instance ID, which is the instance of that request, and basically it will get us back the whole history of the request. This summarizes our common views. Now, as a final view that we'd like to take a look at is our management view. The management view is nothing more than a editable list view of our process.sob. It's an area where we can create information about a new process. So basically, if I run this, I can enter the name of a process. So for example, I can call this process requesting for renewal /new ID. The description might be this process is to enable users to request for new or renewal of their company badges. The process prefix, so you can call it whatever you like, but if we take the first letter from each word from your name of the process, so it'll be RFRNI. So we can call it RFRNI. And you can add the initiation form once you've created it, and we'll see that in the next step. So if I save this right now, it would save it, for example, under ID number 3 here in the database. I would use this ID in my forms in order to generate the name of the process, the status, and so on and so forth, which we will be seeing in the next video, inshallah. I hope the demo was clear. And in the next video, inshallah, we will be looking at how to create our first process using the common objects and common views that we've just created. And the demo would be related to requesting for the renewal or a new company ID. Thank you for listening. And if you have any comments, I will be dropping a link to this video on the Nintex K2 community, and it will be hosted on YouTube. So please feel free to reach out, and inshallah, we will attend to your queries and comments. Thank you.